Excited today. We are still in James chapter 1. We've been in this series on James, Jesus' bold little brother. And today, our conversation is around temptation. And this is a really unique conversation. Now, we're walking through the Bible. Instead of picking and choosing a topic, we're just walking through a letter. One, so we can learn together how to read the Bible, but also because we just have to deal with what's in front of us, okay? So I didn't pick this, and I knew it was going to be here, and I'm like, you know what? They could really use that conversation. This is something that I had to wrestle with throughout the week that we're going to wrestle with together, and it's around temptation. And let me give you this idea that it's about God giving us new life and the power to say no to sin and yes to Jesus. And so because as we build community, this is a place that you don't have to believe and you don't have to, you don't have to believe to belong. We have people who are walking in who are on all kinds of different spiritual journeys. Some of you are Christians, some of you are not. Some of you are somewhere in the middle and you're thinking about becoming a Christian. And so we're going to have to lay some groundwork in order to have this conversation today. So I'm going to give you the big idea on the screen as we get going. You can take notes on your connection card if you would like, or on your phone or whatever. But today's big idea is this: if I can see as God sees, then I will do as God says. If I can see as God sees, I am more likely to do as God says. Last week, if you were here, we had the conversation of God, really James wrestling to say, hey, let's adopt God's perspective. If you can take the glasses you've been wearing off and put on God's glasses and see yourself as God sees you, you might be able to overcome and see some victory in areas. And now we're continuing with that same idea. If I can see as God sees, I'm more likely to do as God says. And again, if you're not a follower of Jesus, I think this is one of the big challenges when it comes to people struggling with the idea of the Christian faith, struggling to follow Jesus, struggling to believe in God, is because they think he's this really mean heavenly school principal with a bunch of rules, and they just don't sound that fun. And so then we are not really down with that. And what unfortunately happens is churches and people with good intentions take the God that we see in the Bible and then translate it over into rules. Don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And so if you grew up in a Christian home, around a Christian home, or knew someone who was Christian, a lot of times growing up, there's a lot of rules and don't do's in order to keep you, and it's well-meaning, but it actually starts to mess up some of the idea of who God is to you and I. And so what I'm going to encourage you and I today is, if I can see as God sees, if we can adopt the perspective that God has, looking at the life and the conversation, especially around temptation today, I believe we can all see some really, really cool victory. Now, James has been hitting on trials in all of chapter 1. He's writing to some Christians who are displaced, they're broken, they're outcast, they are marginalized, and so life is hard. And over again, he's been writing, hey guys, listen, I know life is hard, but don't forget, God is always good. Over and over again, God is good. God is good no matter how hard life is. Now, here's what James knows, is that the harder life gets, the easier it is to give into temptation, right? The harder life gets, the more tired you are, the more isolated you are. Anybody ever get hangry, right? Like, for real, Danielle is starving right now because she forgot to eat today, okay? She had a cookie so far, and she's not as hungry as I would be, so props to you, babe. But if you want to do your own study, you can go to Luke chapter 4, verses 1 through 13, and look at Jesus right before he starts his public ministry. He's 30 years old. He is led by the Spirit of God into the wilderness for 40 days to fast and to pray, and at the end of those 40 days, he is tempted by the devil. And he overcomes that temptation, and he starts his public ministry. But what's unique is the devil shows up at the end of the 40 days when Jesus is isolated, when he is alone, when he is tired, and when he is hungry. And so James knows, as he writes this conversation, that when we are isolated, when we're separated from community, when life is hard, we are more likely to give into temptation. And so in light of the trials that he knows his friends are in, he writes concerning temptation so they can be encouraged. And so let me give you some examples. Maybe you've been working hard. You had a long day, a long week, right? What happens when it comes dinner time? You are more likely to eat unhealthy, to go grab some Taco Bell, to make a poor health decision when it comes to what you eat, because life is hard. And you kind of feel justified in, all right, I'm just going to do that tonight. Or maybe, life is stressful, life has been hard, and so then you take a few more drinks to take the edge off than normal, right? And there's this idea that I deserve it or I need it in order to cope with what's going on. Or maybe you've been struggling and you're feeling alone, and so then you go on a date with somebody that you don't know well just to feel loved. You don't know anything about them. You don't know if that relationship's going to be healthy or good for you, but you just need that interaction, and so you go on a potentially unhealthy date. Some people turn to different drugs to deal with stress when life gets hard, and it starts easy like caffeine. Caffeine's an easily accessible medication that we have in America, right? When we were in Cape Cod, there was a Dunkin' Donuts on like every, half a mile, and life runs on Dunkin'. I think they mean it there, right? I really do think they mean it. And so, right, we have different things. Maybe you turn to caffeine, or you turn to more alcohol, or you turn to weed, right? Weed being legalized here is a way that you say, hey, it's not illegal, and I'm just taking the edge off, but it can become something that we become dependent on, and we're turning to when life gets hard. And maybe you turn into harder drugs, or maybe it's overeating to deal with stress, right? That life is hard, and there's just one way to add some comfort and some pleasure to your life. Or maybe, the midlife crisis conversation. Right? The reason it's called a midlife crisis is because they're in crisis. Life is hard. And so why do they go after a new motorcycle or a new Corvette or a new this or a new that or something important? Why do they get the new makeover and the new wardrobe? Because they're trying to find significance in their life because it's hard, right? And so over and over again, James knows that when life gets hard, we are more likely to give into temptation. Maybe it's at work, right? That life has been hard and you're pushing really hard to gain control and power over your circumstances or your peers or getting that position. Or maybe you find yourself judgmental towards others. And that's one of the ways we cope with making ourselves feel better, is you're overly critical, overly judgmental. Or maybe you struggle with gossip, right? And what it does is it makes us feel important, because I have information that I can give to someone else that maybe they don't have, and so then I'm valuable for that information. Or maybe you struggle with lying to avoid consequences. Right? It's easier to lie than it is to deal with the byproduct of the truth. Or maybe you struggle with envy and jealousy, right? That someone else's grass truly looks better. I wish I had their marriage. I wish I had their friendships. I wish I had their kids. I wish I had that job. I wish I had that car. Right? You see the struggle? And when we are tempted, when life gets hard, temptation looks the most appealing. Maybe you struggle with apathy, toward loving your neighbor. And this one's easy because you can just be tired and start to get apathetic, right? I can go help my neighbor, or I can sleep in. I can go, have dinner with this family, or I can reschedule because I'm sick, right? You have these different things. And so for the record, when we're having this conversation around temptation and sin are not the same thing. Temptation is not sin. Temptation is the bait on the hook. Sin is the hook in your mouth. Okay, that makes sense? And so when we're having this conversation, there's a temptation that we lean into, and that's what we're going to look at. But when we have this conversation around sin, that bait on the hook that we are attracted to, there's sins of omission and commission, meaning there are things that I do that are not helpful, like lying towards somebody or being envious or gossiping. But then there's also sins of omission when I should have done something and I didn't. And I want you to know God is just as concerned with our apathy, our lack of engagement in the world, as he is with what we are doing. And so we're trying to get into this conversation. I'm just laying a groundwork. Maybe one of the things you struggle with, that you're tempted with, is neglection, right? Maybe you withhold love, or you use your body language to communicate your displeasure when life is hard. Maybe you just turn to worry and anxiety in general. Maybe that's your go-to, is when life is hard, you turn to that instead of Jesus. And I want you to know all of these things God cares about, and he wants to give us a better answer. He has something better for us than what is on the hook in front of us. And so the root assumption of this conversation is the reason that you would want to resist temptation is because there's some benefit to avoiding sin, right? Like the only reason this conversation is helpful is if you agree that you want to avoid temptation, right? Some of us put ourselves in scenarios where we actually have better access to temptation. And so I want to lay a groundwork of getting to the place where we can see what God sees. And so, Jose, you can actually go back to the first slide, man. I'm sorry. It'll be a minute. I got to lay some groundwork. So we need to define sin if we're going to agree on anything today, okay? Especially because I don't know what you've grown up with, right? What was the definition of sin? When you hear that word sin, what do you think of? It sounds really religious, and depending on if you grew up even around any religion at all, you might not even know what that word means, and other religions might define it differently. And so I think we have to get on the same page about sin and temptation. Temptation is towards sin, but what are we talking about? What does that mean? The basic definition of the Christian faith, the basic definition and invitation of the Christian faith from Jesus' mouth in Matthew 22 is to love God and to love people. to love God and love people. And that love of God, Romans 5:8 says that we love God because he first loved us. So it's not this love that I manifest and cultivate and like I grit my teeth and try extra hard to love him. It's in response to the love of God that I love him back. So when I met Jesus at 15, that's when everything changed. For the first time, I found out God loved me. He proved that love by letting Jesus die for me. I could have access and a relationship to him because of his love for me. And the overflow of loving God is beginning to love what God loves, which is people. And so that's the basic definition of the Christian faith, to love God and to love people. And so I want to lay a groundwork of what sin is not before we get into what it is. So to live a life of love and joy is what we're talking about, for the glory of God and the good of others, okay? So for the Christian in the room, your calling, if you're trying to simplify it, if you're trying to understand what you're on this planet to do, your life, now that you have a relationship with God, is to glorify God and for the benefit, the good of others. Okay, sin is the exact opposite of that. Sin is not good for you, and it's not good for others. And it's not glorifying to God. Does that make sense? And so when we're trying to define sin, it's anti everything that love would put on the table. So for example, let me help you understand. Lying we would all agree, that is not good for the person. And I'm not talking about white lies because we always try to split hairs there, right? Let's talk about a real lie that's actually deceptive or manipulative or hurtful. It's bad for your character. It's bad for the person you lied to. And it's not glorifying to God because God is a God of truth. Murder, right? No one in the room is going to disagree that murder is not a good idea. It's bad for the other person, clearly, right? It's not good for you, character-wise, and it's not glorifying to God. And you go down the list, whatever it is, anything that God says that we should avoid, there's a reason for it, because it's not good for you or others, and it's not glorifying to God. Now, if we're not careful, we get into this conversation thinking of a list of right and wrong. And this is what religion does, and this is where it gets sticky, is in our culture right now, morality is a relative conversation. What's right for me might not be right for you. And to be honest, that's the wrong conversation to be having. I'm not here to argue that, but it's the wrong focus and the wrong question. Let me ask you a question. Why would I trust my own assessment of right and wrong to the fullest? Not that I have a basic morality, but why would I trust my own personal assessment of right and wrong to the fullest? I've clearly made plenty of decisions to date that I thought were right in the moment that I later regretted. Right? Have you been there? Right? That's where we find ourselves, right? So if I thought something was right in the moment, only later to discover that it wasn't, why would I trust my own assessment of right and wrong? Right? We need to get outside of ourselves, and that's where I want to bring us today, and that's where I think James wants to take us. Have you ever found yourself wanting to do something right and then not doing it? I wish I was patient, and then you overreacted. I wish I was more caring, and then you were selfish. I wish I was this way, and then you ended up doing this way. That's the conversation we're having. So I don't think we can trust ourselves completely when it comes to the assessment of this conversation. And so I want you to think of God, as we have this conversation, to see as God sees. Think of God as both father, a good dad, and judge. Okay? He's both. I don't know what you heard before, but God is both a good dad and he's a judge. Now, the essence of Christian faith is this. Jesus was judged so that God could be your dad. That make sense? Jesus was judged so that God could be your dad. Now, a good dad, I live on a really busy street, and so we play behind the house most of the time, but if we're ever out front, it's really dangerous to let the kids even close past the sidewalk, and so we really watch them. And so over and over again, right, I'll say, hey, Grayson, don't go in the street. Don't go in the street. You know what? In his 3-year-old little mind, sometimes he's mad at me. Dad, you're such a fun sucker. You don't want me to have any fun. You don't love me. You don't, right? And he gets in this moment of not understanding why, right? Do I love him? Yes. I just don't want him to be a pancake in the middle of the street to get hit by a bus, right? I'm a loving dad who cares. The reason I don't want him in the street is because it's potentially harmful for him. In the same way, God is a good dad who loves us. He's not a fun sucker. And I think we get stuck in this in our culture, especially if we had an overbearing amount of rules growing up. is that we have a hard time seeing God as a good dad, and when he says that something's bad for us, it's because it genuinely is bad for us. Now, what happens? When I grew up, my dad would say, hey, don't play in the street. You know what? Now I'm on the other side of the coin, and I agree with him. Why? Because I can see what my dad saw. The problem with temptation, the problem with this conversation is we end up being really short-sighted. And so in the moment, the temptation is so in our face that we have a hard time seeing long-term when it comes to the consequences past the moment. But if I can see as God sees, I can see that why this might be a big deal in the moment. Now, religion says that we need more rules to manage our behavior. And this is where I really want to make sure we get it right, okay? Religion and Jesus are not the same thing. They're not the same thing. They're far from the same thing. Religion says we need more rules to manage our dysfunctional behavior. And Jesus is actually going to go the opposite direction and say, actually, if you could just narrow it down to 2, you're going to be doing really, really good. Jordan Peterson, he wrote a book called The 12 Rules of Life. And he's talking about parenting. And he said, when it comes to parenting, you need to make sure that you have minimal rules. Because bad rules limit the respect of good rules. I read that and I was like, whoa, that is so true. Too many rules actually make me disregard and disrespect all of them. Bad rules actually negate good rules. And so if religion wants to pile all these don'ts onto the table to try to get you so far away from the potential of messing up that maybe you're going to be okay. And Jesus said, it's not going to work. Even if you isolate yourself, shave your head and go live in a cave, it's still not going to work. It's not going to make you right with God. It's not going to make the world a better place. There's got to be a better option. So Jesus says in Matthew 22, love God and love people. If you can do that, everything else will take care of itself. Because when you love God, you don't sin against him. When you love people, you don't sin against them. And you can't manifest that love towards God. It's in response to his love to us. We already talked about that. But Jesus addresses our condition at the heart level, not our behavior. Does that make sense? This is really important for the world that we live in. Jesus is more concerned with our heart than our hands. Our hands are pretty easy to manipulate. When I became a Christian, I stopped cussing because I was told it was wrong. You know what I found later? Most of the time when I would cuss, it was an anger problem, not a cussing problem. You know what didn't go away when I stopped using cuss words? My anger problem. I can still be really angry. I can say some really ugly things and not use a cuss word, right? Religion says, let's polish up the outside. Let's do some behavior modification. It says, Jesus is like, man, that's not going to work. It's not going to do you or the world any good because we got to change you from the inside out. So let me give you a definition. Now this one, man, I worked on it. I think this is really, really helpful. I'm sorry I didn't put it on the screen, but I'm going to give it to you slowly. The essence of faith is not wishful thinking. It's trusting in God as God. So if you're wondering what it means to be a follower of Jesus, it's a simple idea of faith. The essence of faith is not wishful thinking. Like, I hope there's a God up there somewhere and hopefully it works out in the end. It's not this pie in the sky, hopefully it works out for us with weak consciences because we don't know what else to do with our morality. That's not what we're talking about. The essence of faith is trusting that God is God. That he is who he said he is, and that he'll do what he says he can do, starting with making me new, giving me new life through the sacrifice of Jesus, but then continuing in that. That's the essence of faith. The essence of sin. We took a long time to define sin, by the way, but I think this is important. The essence of sin is not, listen to me, it's not wrong behavior. It's trusting in ourselves as God. The essence of faith is trusting in God as God. The essence of sin is trusting in ourselves as God. The temptation to trust in ourselves, friends, is far more dangerous than any one poor, bad decision, because ultimately it's trusting in ourselves to save ourselves. That's why we need Jesus, because our spiritual condition is so broken that we cannot perform enough, work hard enough to make ourselves right with God. That's why Jesus was judged, so God could be our good dad. Now, that's the definition of sin, okay? That's where we're going. And so James is writing to Christians, people who have acknowledged their sin, and their need for God. And they gave their lives to Jesus, and he's now made them new. And so now, as we get into this conversation, the same power that Jesus overcame temptation with is the same power living in every individual follower of Jesus. This is so important. Listen, in Luke 4, Jesus was tempted but without sin. James's hope and encouragement for you and I today is this, that you can win against sin. You can turn to Jesus. You can run from sin. You can be victorious over this conversation when it comes to temptation. Why? Because the same Spirit that gave Jesus the power to say no to the devil in the wilderness is the same Spirit that lives in you if you're a follower of Jesus. And if you have not trusted in God to save you and set you free, to be your good dad, to adopt you into that family, if you have not done that, then at the point in time that you do that, that is when you receive the Holy Spirit and the power to win out. All right, you guys ready? What's up, man? Welcome. So glad you're here. We're going to be in James chapter 1, verse 12. All of that to get to what we're about to do. And, man, I think this is going to be super, super helpful. And so here's the conversation. God blesses those who patiently endure testing and temptation. Afterward, they will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. James is talking to Christians who are struggling, and he says, hey, patiently endure, don't give up. So when it comes to temptation, here's point number 1. I'm going to throw it up on the screen. Point number 1 is this. When it comes to temptation, think you're an athlete. You're an athlete. Okay, I don't know how many of you are actually an athlete in the room. It's the Boulder over the weekend. We have one of the biggest influxes of people ever during the year. It's crazy around here. Tomorrow, by the way, don't drive anywhere because all the roads are shut down. We have an influx of, I think they said 60,000 people that come into Boulder on the weekend to be a part of the Boulder. And some of them are aspiring athletes, and then some of them are just like you and me and just like to go for the festivities. But when it comes to temptation, this conversation, think you're an athlete. Now, let's go back to the verse real fast so I can show you. He says that God blesses those who patiently endure. That endurance word, right? If you ever been on a treadmill, right, it takes endurance. If you've been on a bike, it takes endurance. He said God blesses those who patiently endure that testing and temptation. Now, the blessing, that word, it means the favor of God, okay? And he's not talking specifically about any one kind of blessing when it comes to this conversation. It's overall the favor of God on your life. Now, I don't know where you are. Maybe you're not a follower of Jesus in the room. Maybe you are. But I want the favor of God on my life. Okay? And so he says, God will bless those who endure temptation, who resist, who are able to run that race. And he says, afterward, they will receive the crown of life. Now, I want you to know the crown of life is, think gold medal from the Olympics, right? That would be the equivalent of what they heard. When they read this from James, Jesus' little brother, they would have heard Olympic gold medal. Okay? And that feathery wreath thing that stick on their head, right? It's not near as cool as a gold medal, but it's okay. They would have thought, God's going to give us this crown of life, this gold medal. It's the Stanley Cup. It's whatever you want to call it. You get to win in the end. So where's he going with this? Here's the big idea of that first point, is that you can win. You can win when it comes to temptation, when it comes to the conversation of living a life that is glorifying to God, good for you and good for others. You can win. You're an athlete, and he's trying to encourage you, right? Think about all these Christians who are displaced, and they're having a hard time, and life is hard. He's saying, listen, don't be discouraged. Don't give in. I know it's hard. I know it looks really tasty. I know you want to give in, but don't, because you're an athlete, and you have endurance. You can run that marathon. You can keep pushing, push through the wall, and he's trying to give them encouragement. So listen, I don't know where you walked in today or what you're struggling with, but here's the big idea. You can win in your marriage. You can win in your emotional life. You can win in your physical life. You can win over your weight. You can win over your mouth. You can win over your relationships. You can win with your money. You can win with your kids. You can win is his point, no matter what you're struggling with, no matter what's difficult, because of the power of God living inside of you. You can win. You can actually overcome. You can endure. You can make it to the end. And he says that crown of life is the one that God has promised to those who love him. And that's pointing towards the life after this. And so listen, you're not just running the race for right now. It's for the good of others. It's a benefit to you. It's for the glory of God. But at the end of the day, this life is running toward a goal after this life. And he's saying at that point in time, not only is God going to bless you now, but you're going to receive the crown of life. You don't earn it. You're not working hard to make your way into heaven. This is a reward in addition to that. And I think it's because God's a good dad and he knows we like a reward, right? And so he's trying to motivate us. Hey, resist temptation because it's worth it. Now, hopefully that's encouraging to you. right? You're an athlete. I don't know where you walked in. You might still want a six-pack and some bigger biceps, but you're an athlete. You can do it. Don't give up. Don't quit. Now, he goes on in verse 13, and he says, remember, trying to remind us of something, that when you're being tempted, don't say, God is tempting me. God's never tempted to do wrong, and he never tempts anyone. Temptation comes from our own desires, which entice and drag us away. I want you to pay attention to those last words. Entice and drag us away. That's fishing terms, okay? Entice, like a lure that's shiny with a tasty worm on the end of it. And what happens when you get a hook in your mouth? You get dragged away into the boat and hit with a club over the head, right? That's what happens in somebody's dinner. So when it comes to temptation, here's point number 2. First of all, think you're an athlete. Number 2, think you're a dumb fish. I hope that's encouraging to you, okay? First one comes out of the bat, and it's encouraging. Yeah, I'm an athlete. Number 2, you're a dumb fish. And this is meant to be humbling for us, okay? Listen, let me help you out. God is not dangling the bait on a hook in front of you to see if you're going to fail. I think some people really think, like, God's just out to get me, and he's not. Listen, you have an enemy, and it's not God, okay? You have an enemy. His name is the devil. And the sin that's living inside of us, that thing we were born with that gives us a natural disposition away from God and towards our own desires. You have an enemy and it's not God. One of my friends, Nick Burleson, said that God is not out to get you. He's out to get you home. I'm like, man, that's a real, think good dad, right? God doesn't have to be your judge because he already judged Jesus so he can be your dad. That's the conversation we're having. Now, as we have this conversation when it comes to thinking you're a dumb fish, this entice and drag away. Will you go back to that verse? Thank you. So he has this conversation, and he says, man, listen, it's bait on a hook. And I don't know if you're a fisherman, fisher guys, fisher women. I'm not a fisher person very well. I can stick a worm on a hook and maybe catch something, but that's about as good as it gets. But here's what I understand about fishing. Every fish has a favorite bait, right? You with me? Like, there's a book somewhere, I'm sure, that told me that, or whatever. I do know that there's different kinds of reels and lures and things that you use to catch different kinds of fish. And so here's the encouragement from James as we're having this conversation around living a life against temptation for the glory of God and the good of others. It's, don't forget you're a dumb fish, and you have a favorite bait, right? So pay attention to it. So listen, this is where you can be humble. Where do you struggle? That's the question that we're asking right now. Where do you struggle? Here's the reality. What you struggle with might not be what I struggle with. And this is where Christians and religious people get in trouble, is they get stuck on the rules of because I can't have something, you can't have something, and then they try to push, because I'm tempted by this bait, then you must be tempted by that bait, and so we all got to avoid that bait. Right? And the reality is alcohol is a real problem for some people and not for others, right? So religion messes up behavior modification, and James is trying to help us have a conversation about, hey, know what you struggle with. What is it for you? Some of you, maybe you can be around certain bait for others, like alcohol, and you're like, oh, you know what, that's not a big problem for me. Or maybe, being around drugs has never been a big problem. And I know other friends, right, they can't be around alcohol. They can't go to bars because it's the intergate of a long, long road and a really bad night and a bad morning the next day, right? They know themselves. And so can you be humble with me and say, man, you know what, I know my bait. So I'm going to be transparent with you. When it comes to the conversations of bait, we can see from Luke 4, which I encouraged you earlier to go study on your own, 3 types of bait, if you will. 3 categories that every temptation falls under. And it's the bait of comfort, the bait of significance, and the bait of control. Those 3 things, comfort, significance, control, you can say it however you want: pleasure, power, prestige, right? The 3 ways, it doesn't matter. Go look and read Luke 4, and you can see Jesus is tempted in 3 ways. Everything that we find ourselves struggling with falls under those categories. And so what is it for you? I'll give you mine, okay? I became a Christian at 15, almost 16 years old. Sexual temptation has always been like the biggest stronghold in my life. Before I was a Christian, after I was a Christian, led to unhealthy relationships, unhealthy patterns, unhealthy brain makeup. Right? I did studies that showed me that pornography actually messes with your neurological system, right? Well, that would have been really nice to know at 12 years old, right? But rather than what I didn't have around me helping me navigate. And so I had a really, really bad start to having healthy relationships. And so now, today, I know it's my bait, okay? Now, you got to think about it. If you're a dumb fish in the water, what does a fish do? Their favorite bait shows up at eye level in front of them. They're like, ho-ho, Check it out. My favorite thing ever is right here sitting in front of me. What do they do? Right? Like they bite the bait every time. And he says, hey, be humble. No, you're a dumb fish. You have a bait that is going to trip you up more than others. And so some of you, you know what? You might be able to walk through Victoria's Secret and not have a problem. Not me, okay? Danielle and I go to Victoria's Secret. I stand outside, right? Because I know myself. I know myself. Or I look at the floor the whole time because I got to like pay, bring my credit card in. I'm like, here you go. I know me. There was a friend at Watermark. He's not really a friend. That's very kind of me to say that. But there's a guy at a really big church in Watermark that I've never met in my life. And he said, given the opportunity, they value consistent transparency like we do as one of our values. He said this from the stage, given the opportunity, I would sleep with all your wives. This pastor said that from the stage. I'm like, whoa. All right. I'm like, I know where he's coming from. I don't know that I would say that. But I get what he's trying to do. He's trying to be transparent about his bait. Does that make sense? And when we can be transparent about it, when we know it, when we get it out there, then we can actually avoid it. And so what's the point? Swim around your bait. Don't hang out around your bait. Stay away from your bait. And so for me, since I became a Christian, I started to have victory in these areas where I've got blocks on my phone, blocks on my computer. Danielle has the remote over certain, controls. I mean, there's a lot of things that help me stay away from that bait because I know I'm not strong enough. I'm a dumb fish. I don't ride in the car with another woman of the opposite sex alone, right? I mean, we take every precaution to say, hey, I'm a dumb fish. I know my bait. What's yours? What's yours? He tells us where it comes from. Temptation comes from our own desires. And so sometimes we get stuck in this conversation and we say, man, that's just the way that I am. I just struggle in that area. I'm just impatient. I'm just unkind. I'm just straightforward and blunt. And what that really means is you're a jerk, right? And we say, it's just the way that I am. I got to be true to myself. And listen, guys, that's a bad idea. Yourself is the one that keeps getting you into trouble. So you don't need to be true to yourself, right? The conversation is be true to Jesus. What he's inviting us into is a better life than we live on our own. Now remember, the benefit is it's hurting me, it's hurting those around me, and it's not glorifying to God when I give into temptation. But the point is that temptation's on a hook in the water. You don't have to bite it. You're an athlete. You can win. But no, you're a dumb fish, and pay attention. And so we have the capacity in the family of God to run away from sin and run to Jesus. So you might be here and you say, hey, Drake, how do I know? How do I know what my bait is? Maybe you're not, maybe not me, and you're just very familiar with it. Ask a friend. Ask someone close to you. Ask someone you grew up with in your family. Ask somebody. They probably know. Okay, they're not going to sugarcoat it for you. Look at your bank account. Right? What do you spend money on? Right? If you can kind of track where you find your money goes a lot, that might be a temptation area for you. Dig into the Bible. Right? We're not making this stuff up. God's a good dad. He loves us. He wants the best for us. So dig into the Bible and let's see. What does God say is not good for me and others? Here's the last one. You ready? When it comes to temptation, think you're an athlete, you're a dumb fish. The last one is you are way out of his league. Here's what temptation looks like. This video real fast. When temptation shows up, here's what happens.
Who are you? And how did you find me?
Aha.
Who are you? And how did you find me?
I know not who you are, nor how I came to find you, but may I just say, hi. How you doing? The name's Flynn Rider.
Okay, that's what temptation does, right? Shows up, asks you on a date. Okay, I want you to know temptation always overpromises, underdelivers. Sin is always more enticing, right? You can't see the hook on the end of it. Every fish finds out later that was a bad idea. In the moment, you can't tell, right? So that's temptation. That's what it looks like when we have this conversation. Now, let's go to verse 15 of James chapter 1. Let me show you this. He says that in the process, if you bite the hook, if you give in, if temptation shows up and says, hey, how's it going? My name's Temptation. And you give in, it says those desires give birth to sinful actions. And when sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death. James is trying to help them understand, listen, sin always overpromises and underdelivers. There's always something worse at the end. It always feels good. Listen, it always feels good in the moment. We wouldn't do it if it wasn't appealing, if it didn't taste good, if it didn't look good, if it didn't feel good. That's one of the lies, right? I remember growing up and people trying not to get teenagers to have sex. Like, don't do it. It's awful. It's bad for you, right? And then they're like, No, it's not, right? And they find out, right? What they don't know is how it affects your soul and how it affects your mind and how it affects your relationships. But God does. So the big idea is, man, if I can see what God sees, then I might be more willing to do what God says. And so James is trying to help us understand, hey, listen, I know when life gets hard, you're more tempted. You can win. But don't forget, you're a dumb fish. So pay attention to the bait that you're attracted to. And the last one is, listen, you're way out of his league. When temptation shows up, here's the process. I want you to think about dating, okay? Temptation shows up, says, hey, how's it going? And we're all in that moment. We got to make a decision. And sometimes we choose to go on a date, right? We're like, okay, let's give it a shot. We're like, no, not doing anything. Just a nice casual dinner. Just going to go hang out, go on a date. All of a sudden, you start messing around with your sin. Uh-oh. What happened? Sin got pregnant. Right? That's the conversation he's having. So he's using pregnancy in a negative turn. You go on a date, all of a sudden it leads to messing around. All of a sudden you get your sin pregnant, and what happens? Oh no, it has a life of its own. What started over here, all of a sudden it's got a life of its own, and then I give birth, and it's growing, and it's out of control, and it's getting stronger, and then what happens? Death. Death. The wages of sin, the payment of sin is death. God knows that. He's a good dad who loves us. Every time you lie to somebody, it doesn't make that relationship better. God loves us, and he wants to help us. And so death physically, death spiritually, death relationally. Every time we give into that temptation, go on a date, start messing around, get it pregnant, all of a sudden it gets a life of its own, and it's death relationally and emotionally and neurologically and to our future and to our kids and to our jobs and our career and our friendships and our health. And you've seen it probably too many times. So my invitation is, man, can we line up with what God says, believe what he has for us, and win out? Now, I think what happens here is that most of the time, we end up here and we say, man, I didn't mean for it to go this far. And the last thing I want you to do, religion is so good at making you feel bad about the decisions that you make. And it's not very good about helping you get out of them. And that's not what Jesus came to bring. And so I think we get on the other side of this and we say, man, I never meant it to go that far. I never meant for that decision to go where it is. And you might ask the question, well, what if I'm an athlete who quit? What if I'm a fish with a hook in his mouth today? What if I got my sin pregnant? What do I do? Friends, that's why Jesus died. That's why Jesus died. We can't fix ourselves. Can't get the hook out of our mouths on our own. The wage of sin, the payment for sin is death. But because Jesus had no sin, he overcame death for us. And so this conversation where James has been going is I've got to give my life to Jesus to find victory over these things. If you're a Christian in the room, listen, one of the things we try to do is we try to control it. And while it's wise to avoid it, we don't have the power to control it. We got to kill it. So you can read the Bible, and one of the things that one of the writers of the New Testament would say was, every day I have to crucify my flesh. I have to kill this thing so that Jesus can win out. And it's not, bam, I gave my life to Jesus and I never sin again. Right? I'm a dumb fish who happens to have a new life thanks to Jesus, but it doesn't mean that bait doesn't look good anymore. Listen, you might not, if you're from a third world country, you never had pizza, it might look good, but you're like, right? But once you've had pizza and you smell pizza again, right? You're like, I could go for some pizza, right? And that's what James is saying. Know yourself, be humble, and pay attention. Now, a couple of things as we close out. 1 John says that if we confess our sins to God, he forgives us. James is writing to Christians who have given their sin over to Jesus. He's made them new. They have new life. They're born again spiritually. And so maybe you're not a Christian in the room, and that's one of the things that you need to do is start that relationship with God. God's a good dad who loves you. He's going to give you a new life, a new relationship, a new spiritual nature, and the power to overcome the sin, the power to win the race, the power to use that wisdom, and the power to pay attention. But in addition to that, James 5:16 says that if we confess our sin to one another, we find healing. So that's why we have city groups that meet throughout the week on any given week. Is because when we can get that temptation, we can get that bait out in the open. There's lots of people who know me, who love me, and know my bait. And so I'm able to have people around me who hold me accountable, who watch out for me, who pray for me. It's one of the benefits of being a part of a group. And so again, remember, where it started is where temptation is heaviest is when we're isolated, when we're alone, and when we're tired and hungry. And so that's why it's helpful to have healthy community around you. And so I don't know where you walked in today. I don't know where you are on your spiritual journey, but I want to invite you back to the big idea. And that's this. If I can see as God sees, just will you throw that up on the screen? Thanks, man. If I can see as God sees, I will do as God says. I'm more likely to agree with God and to pay attention if I can see as he sees. If I can understand that he's a good dad who loves me, and that whatever it is that I'm resisting and fighting against is for my good, for the good of others, and the glory of God. So I'm going to pray for us right now, and we're going to close out our time together. Will you bow your heads with me?